I want to take just a minute to provide a little bit of an introduction to this conversation with Steve Hayes. Absolutely phenomenal, engaging, intriguing conversation. Some of it the first time through went a little bit over my head, which is why I'm here to, after listening through a couple of times and adding the graphics, to kind of break down what I think Dr. Hayes is getting at, the key points of our discussion. So, because Dr. Hayes is just too freaking smart, too much of a nerd for an average Joe like me to understand one time through, I tried to simplify what he was saying, organized into 5 points below. So, number one is that eugenics has its roots in the scientific community and was promoted as a way to purify the population by prominent statisticians and those working in academia way before Hitler's rise to power in Nazi-led Germany. Number two, psychology and psychiatry, at their roots, were led by prominent eugenicists for more than 50 years with efforts to identify supposedly genetically inferior individuals via terms like feeble-mindedness, later schizophrenia, and eventually mass sterilize these people, or at its worst, euthanize them in a genocidal movement. Number three, this scientific dogma of the eugenics movement paved the way for the extermination and sterilization of tens of millions of Black, brown, Jewish, physically and mentally disabled individuals around the world. And I think Steve and myself fear that we're still operating in a similar fashion with these efforts to label and identify those who are deemed inferior, albeit in 2025 in a much more covert fashion. Number four, the science backing up these eugenic ideas is bad and inaccurate. You cannot just look at one trait like intelligence within an entire population, plot every individual on a bell curve, and then deem the lowest quartile or the lowest 10% inferior. There are not only so many different characteristics that we need to plot people on, but in reference to Charles Darwin, who many consider the father of evolutionary biology, Darwin's quote is, "It is not the strongest nor the most intelligent that survives, but the ones most adaptable to change." AKA, to use a little bit of ACT speak, acceptance and commitment therapy, which Steve Hayes is essentially the founder of, the originator of, the most flexible individuals survive. And that leads to point number 5. There is not a good way in modern statistics to measure an individual's abilities to change over time. This will not be captured by some of the fundamental statistical methods and tools, necessitating new and novel ways of measuring people's adaptability or ability to change over time. So Steve makes a very strong and compelling argument that the field of statistics absolutely needs to incorporate the fact that individuals can and do change over time, sometimes significantly, and that's one thing we need to plot: as many individuals' ability to change over time and understand the factors that allow each individual to change, then put that information into groups and populations, but not to just look at basic characteristics, whether it be physical strength or intelligence or aesthetic beauty, as these unchanging and concrete characteristics that we live with throughout our lives. So hopefully that 5-point explanation helps in preparation for this conversation. I cannot emphasize how important it is to consider that some of the same scientific underpinnings that led to the travesties and atrocities of the Holocaust and eugenic-led genocide of tens of millions of individuals still has relevance today. And if we don't want to see history repeat itself, we have to have a sense of hyper-awareness on this. it needs to be taught in basic psychology and psychiatry courses so we know the history from which we come. Hope you enjoy. Absolutely fascinating conversation. And more importantly, I hope that you learn and can utilize some of the information presented in this conversation today. Thanks for listening.
Somebody get this guy some help!
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
So today I'm having Dr. Stephen Hayes back on to discuss the history of eugenics in psychiatry and psychology. As a background, in May, I attended an ACT boot camp for the first time, which I highly recommend for any novice or even advanced ACT practitioner or therapy provider that is yet to engage in any official training. It was an extremely emotionally salient experience that actually prompted me to finally go out and engage in my own therapy, not to be confused with intellectualizing my baggage and my problems with my residency cohorts and my psychologically trained friends. On the third day of that training, Steve, looking like Johnny Cash in his all black attire, gave a moving presentation on the history of eugenics and psych, pointing to our tendencies to label people as a way of ostracizing them, with genocidal and sterilization campaigns at the root of our initial labels of feeble-mindedness as well as schizophrenia. Now, I'm not saying that diagnostic labels and categories are not helpful to guide treatment, but they're way too simplified to fully rely on in treating individuals who are comprised of a complex set of factors, including genetics, temperaments inherited from their parents or learned from their parents, their behaviors in their own lives, and their past experiences that help shape their relationally framing minds. Without further ado, I welcome back Steve Hayes to Renegade Psych and thank him for helping me to say yes to things even when they're really freaking scary.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Ethan. And I was sharing before you went on, it's a little scary even to step into this space because, I'm not trying to shame people who are good-hearted scientists doing the best they can in our diagnostic system, things that we just do, and the vast majority of people need to do in order to even be paid to do work in the mental health space. But there is a dirty history, and it has been suppressed or not talked about, and it's extensive. If you wanted to have an intro to psychology class and you wanted a nice book that went through the history of the connection between our biostatistical ideas, our diagnostic ideas, psychometrics, and eugenics, you can't find it. And it is so extensive that it's shocking. American Psychological Association, the estimates are something like from 1897 to 1947, about 2/3 of the presidents of APA, what we call big APA, the psychiatrists always wince when we say that, were card-carrying eugenicists. You can't build a foundation on a field where it's that extensive and then flip the switch because of what the Nazis did and then not own that this has implications for what we're doing. So it's not about shaming and blaming, but I'm welcoming the opportunity to lean in here for probably the first time on a podcast with stuff I've been working on for about the last 5 years.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to do so. I do have to mention that Dr. Dave Casey at University of Louisville did give a lecture on the history of psychiatry and did mention the involvement with eugenics, but it was a blip in the radar in terms of the overall totality of my training. Can you first just kind of lay out what eugenics is for those who may not know or may not be aware, and how it historically was kind of embedded in the movement in Nazi Germany?
people think eugenics was really, the Nazis were pushing it. No, they were being pushed by an academic field called behavioral science. So the word, it refers to sort of good breeding, and it was one that Galton used. He created the field of eugenics, but he also did a lot of wonderful things. He was the first person to realize fingerprints could be used to identify, etc. He was a polymath, really. And he developed some of the statistical bases that we use in many, many, many fields. The standard deviation, for example, something you learned in high school probably. That's Galton. You might have seen the little bean board or the quincunx, that's the technical name, where you drop the marbles down and they, show you a nice bell curve when you're trying to understand normal distributions, because it's an expression of what happens when you have the binomial distribution, 50-50 chances all the way down. Drop the marbles in, it's going to form a little bell curve like that. The bell curve was first developed by Quetelet, who was the guy who became an astronomer, actually, and wanted to know where the planets are and the stars and so forth. You get estimates from a whole bunch of people, and you figure, well, the central tendency is true, and each estimate, since the stars can't be moving around, must be slight errors in the people who are looking up at the stars. So the differences between the observers were error, and they would figure out a way to sort of determine what the central tendency is, so you can make the best guess about where that star is night to night or where that planet is, and apply your statistical formulas to try to understand the cosmos. What Galton did was that go from an interest in the central tendency. Quetelet actually said anything that deviates from the average in human beings is deformation, or used the word like that. In other words, if you're not average, there's something wrong with you. What Galton did is he said, wait a minute, I'm really interested in the tips of this distribution. And he had developed the standard deviation to describe how far out from the center it would have to be unexpected. And he was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin. Well, the other grandson of Erasmus Darwin is Charles Darwin. And he got out of the gates first. And Francis was a little bit envious of his cousin. And he especially liked the chapter on artificial selection, because they had just started breeder books and deliberately creating sheep who have longer fur and cows that produce more milk and so forth. That had just started just a few decades earlier. And artificial selection, you could use breeding as a kind of a model for it and these early genetic ideas. So Galton wrote his first book about this, called Hereditary Genius. And what he did is he looked at the families in the UK, the children of the wealthy and powerful versus the people who are not especially adept, either rich or known to be excellent. And he gave us a whole bunch of ways to think about our lives. Nature, nurture, that's Galton. Raw G in intelligence, that's Galton. He developed the statistical tools, the standard deviation, especially at that point, to try to explain why the law of mathematics suggests that Charles Darwin is right, but what we should do is now use his theory to deliberately breed better human beings, and created the field and named it of eugenics. And he concluded in his book, Hereditary Genius, that we should set up policies to restrict lower class people from having children, and we should set up policies to encourage upper class, white persons in the UK having children. Very soon, there was a number of people who became his students and gathered around it. And if you say something like a correlation, you're probably talking initially about Carl Pearson, Pearson's R. Everybody knows it. You use it all the time. Yeah, but if you actually read the writings of Carl Pearson while he's developing those tools, he's also saying we should restrict the inclusion into our germ plasm of deficient people unwarranted by any statistical analysis, and not allowing them to enter into the UK. He literally was writing letters to for example, keep Jewish people, who most of us nowadays would think of as pretty smart critters. No, in the way he thought about it, these were the lower, dumb people. And if they came into the UK and were allowed to breed with the upper class white Protestant people, that's going to pollute the gene pool of the UK. He was actively writing letters to policymakers to keep the Jews out. So if you look at the early history and you just click off, and I have pictures in there, it kept going. You know, if you do chi-square, you might know about the Yates correction if the number isn't, well, Frank Yates was a eugenicist. If you want to use something like the Fisher Z, R.A. Fisher was a professor of eugenics. A lot of the early statisticians were card-carrying eugenicists or actually professors of eugenics. And so they were developing the tools for that purpose. That is true also of the people who are doing diagnostic work, IQ tests, development of terms like schizophrenia. So in the early days, the way that we were developing statistical tools to allow us to characterize people, personality tests, IQ tests, achievement tests, etc., psychometrics, all those kinds of tools were based on a mathematical model that was focused on differences between people. It was called the psychology of individual differences. But it was not about the individuals. It was about the differences. And then using that to characterize the individuals. So psychology, at the very, very beginning, buys into this agenda. Biostats buys into this agenda. And diagnosis did as well. So if you take something like schizophrenia, that's Bleuler, and he first uses the term, but then go read his 1924 textbook on psychiatry. Just read it. It says that the more severely deficient should be prohibited from having children because the burden that it will put on the rest of us and the impact it'll have on the gene pool that will persist over generations is far too costly. When I gave the talk you're talking about, part of the reason I knew about some of the stuff about mental deficiency is that my own mentor, John Cohn, was trained by Alan Edwards, who was a really good psychometrician. The Edwards personality inventory, social desirability responding is something you have to worry about in testing and so forth. That's my mentor's mentor. Well, his mentor, A.R. Gilliland, was a major psychologist, created the Midwestern Psychological Association, etc. But I'm giving a talk, and my mentor is coming, and it's my last lecture, when I retired from the university. And so my students came and stuff, and I kind of knew what was probably there. And I said, I just can't give this talk about the history of eugenics in the field without saying, well, what is about my own history? And so I start studying really carefully A.R. Gilliland, and there he is, 1917 Journal of Delinquency. Here's his test for feeble-mindedness. And right in that same journal here's the call to sterilize juvenile delinquents. So that's the history. And if you think 1917, that's way before Hitler. That's way before the Nazis. So what happened, because of the psychoanalytic hold of the UK and parts of Europe, they held off. They didn't like this move. But the American behavioral sciences of psychiatry and psychology loved it and started setting up committees, initially with the American Breeders Association, a little creepy, but they did. And then it became the American Eugenic Association, journals, etc., studies, etc. And it was considered progressive. And every state in the Union had laws that permitted sterilization, involuntary sterilization of people based on their mental faculties and based on things like diagnoses, alcoholism, the level of IQ. And it passed muster with the Supreme Court, a Buck versus Bell, very famous thing, where Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's like this star of liberal justice, really a bulwark of, the courts, fairly restricting the The other two branches of government wrote the opinion, and the critical line there was whether they could sterilize children of people who had IQs that are low involuntarily. And the answer was the famous line is, the laws on vaccination are broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So the Supreme Court turned loose. Every single state had the laws, and hundreds of thousands of people were sterilized in the United States of America, every single state. And some of them, like the biggest one was California. You wonder why Black and brown people are worried about vaccinations nowadays, you know, or Native Americans. Native Americans were systematically decimated, not just by grabbing their kids and throw them into a school that you had to go for hours to even get to see your kids. No, they would sterilize Native Americans involuntarily. Those laws that were written here in the 1920s, with the active support of the intelligentsia of the behavioral sciences, saying that this is evidence-based, to the point of actually actively suppressing data that they had that showed that that was not quite true, were adopted word for word by the Third Reich. And by the way, I'm Jewish by the maternal line. I mean, my great aunts and uncles have 8 of them. 5 of them died in ovens, or one blown up by Stalin in a ship that was trying to get to Palestine. So I have a family connection to this. But the laws that led to the final solution were first implemented with people who had mental health disorders, schizophrenics, alcoholism, and some other things, like epilepsy. And every provider in Germany, every physician, every medical provider was required to send in the reports to a central office of each person. And then a special program was set up, a secret program, because Hitler knew the church would object. And people who had any kind of problem like schizophrenia, the family would get a letter saying, we have a special treatment program for you and your family member, chronically depressed, and we got a special treatment program for your mother. Send her to this hospital, etc. And the nurses would get a list each day of who would die, and they would chain them on the balconies until they froze to death. They would inject them with poison. Eventually, they figured out that they'd be easier just to gas them and burn them, put them in mass graves, but then they would create a false grave with a cross on it and send a little note to the family saying, oh my goodness, that wart on Aunt Mabel's foot became cancerous. It's so sad, but we had to bury her like yesterday, but here's your grave that you can go pray over. There was nothing in the grave. They had been burned and thrown into a mass grave or whatever. It was called Action T4. And still today, they're finding how extensive it was, because when the wall fell between Germany and Western, they thought it was tens of thousands. It's now getting up into several hundred thousand. And 2 years later, finally, they decided the Jews would be included. They had already worked out the logistics about how to do mass killings. So if you're a psychologist, you need to know this as part of your history and make sure that we aren't inadvertently using tools that are still fulfilling Galton's eugenic dreams. They were doing it thinking they were helping humanity because they were going to eliminate the gene pool of the deficient, and we would have this wonderful world where there wouldn't be any juvenile delinquents, no schizophrenics, nobody with epilepsy, etc., because we will have systematically weeded them out, just like you do if you're going to breed cows. It's bad evolutionary science, it turns out, but it's still embedded deeply in these tools that we're using. So you have the scaffolding of the conversation we can now have of how we got into a place where mainstream science says you have to use tools to understand people because they're required. You can't use an assessment unless you use psychometrics. You can't publish a study unless it's backed up by randomized controlled trials, put through these same kind of statistical procedures, and on it goes, where the use case of those information is not a collective, it's a particular person. And it turns out that's statistically impossible, and it has a dirty history. So we need to push a reset button and head in a new direction.
That information was on so many levels so illuminating that embedded in all of this initial statistical research were these ulterior motives.
Yeah.
This was not a new idea. You had for centuries before that, you had royalty marrying royalty and thinking that these superior genetics would yield superior offspring. That didn't really work out because if you have enough inbreeding, you're going to have a lot of intellectual disability that comes with that. And, you mentioned evolutionary science. I really do kind of view what I do as a psychiatrist, as a therapist, as a provider from an evolutionary lens. I don't want to live in a world that's full of all highly intellectual people. That does not serve our world. We need diversity. We need variety in order for us to survive. I mean, I always talk about with my severely depressed patients, there's a yin and a yang to this depression thing. Depressed people tend to be more skeptical. They tend to be the ones I always think about living in the cave, who are sitting in the back of the cave and somebody comes around to sell their snake oil from a neighboring tribe. And the hopeful ones are all big believers in whatever they're selling and willingly going to trade their furs and their materials for fire, their food. But that depressed person sitting in the back of the cave may be significantly more skeptical. I mean, you see it in the history of certain presidents in the United States, like Abraham Lincoln. One of the things that I think struck me the deepest kind of emotionally or personally was the vulnerability that you expressed up on that stage in talking about your personal history. You just mentioned that your mother was Jewish and that you have several Jewish relatives, including ones that died in the travesties of the Holocaust. If you're willing, could you tell a little bit about the other side?
It does put a special punch for me of exploring the history of eugenics and biostats and the need for creating a different way forward. I didn't know I was Jewish by the maternal line until I was a teenager. My mother told me then. She had told me that her name was Ruth Eileen Dreyer. It's Ruth Esther Dreyer. My second daughter is named Esther, in part as a nod to that. And if I'd known she was named Ruth Esther, I might have been able to figure out she might have been Jewish, but she was a practicing Roman Catholic, and my dad was an Irish Catholic, and I was raised in Catholic schools and went to Loyola Marymount as a college and so forth. But when she finally said that to me, I mean, of course, I wasn't feeling like, oh my goodness, that's terrible. I was like, oh, that's awesome. And I tell the story when I met my Jewish relatives, I said, oh my God, my mother's not weird. She's Jewish. Because, I could tell that my mom was different from the other kids around me, but I didn't know why. What had happened is that her mother, very beautiful lady, had married this aristocratic German guy who converted to Judaism, even got it circumcised as an adult by family lore. I don't know if that's true, but by family lore, which is a bit of a commitment. So Joseph Dreyer, part of the von Leicester family in Germany, von just meaning to have some baron kind of royalty, lower level royalty kind of thing in the feudal Germany, marries Mate Schmilewicz. All right. With the rise of German nationalism, Joseph Dreyer, now living in the United States with my mother and Ruth and Mate, becomes a Nazi sympathizer and starts telling my mother things like, don't tell people you have tainted blood. Now, I knew that history, it leaked out. And I knew that Joe then eventually divorced Mate. She got tuberculosis, was put you had to be quarantined permanently if you had TB, unless it would cure itself, and they didn't have good ways of treating TB at the time. So she's in a care facility there in Long Island, and Joe decides to divorce her. And I knew that. Uh, that was I thought, the tragic story. Turns out there was more to it, which I found out after my mother died at age 93, about 9 years ago, when through 23andMe I discovered that my mother's sister's younger son lived about 120 miles away, Les Millet. He's still alive. I've been with him a couple times, correspond with him, and went and spent some time with him. And one of the first meetings, he said, "Well, you know what happened to her grandmother?" And I said, "No." I said, "Well, she died in this sanatorium." I said, "Yeah, I know that." After Joe had divorced her, he said, "Well, it's actually not that. What happened was, uh, after the divorce, your mother's mother asked your mother to quit college and move back home and visit her once a week, which is all that you're allowed in the TB sanitarium. And my mother had a scholarship, said, no, no, please don't ask that of me. Joe won't pay, my father won't pay for it. And I've got a scholarship. If I do that, I won't have a college education. Please don't ask this of me. I'd only be able to visit you once a week." She went back to college, and a week later, my grandmother killed herself. So my whole life makes more sense. My mother would wash her hands till they bled. She was depressed chronically. If I left the house almost every single time, she would say, "Don't eat the oleander," these beautiful flowering but poisonous bushes that were outside the door in El Cajon, a suburb of San Diego, where they grow very nicely. So I didn't understand why she was so, you know, anxiety ridden. And of course, now I do. She thought she killed her mother. And but point of that story, though, is that these generational traumas pass along and have been fostered by the field that I'm in and the field that you're in. If you take responsibility and you say, well, why was it so easy for the Third Reich to do what they did? It was because the United States of America had the laws and the Supreme Court decisions that said this is the right thing to do, and they built it on the support of the intelligentsia of the day, to the point that 2/3 of the presidents of APA, and it would be the same thing in psychiatry if you chase it. Of course, these things get hidden. People quickly want to dust it over after the Nazis. You saw where it went. I say it to my students this way. We sometimes say, oh, we so wish that the society would listen to us. If only they would know, if they would take the wisdom in psychotherapy and put it into the schools, and I say, no, the problem is that they didn't listen to us. The problem is that they did. And we are still living. You just look at, what happens when immigration happens because of climate change and things like that. I mean, suddenly people are just so worried about, what's going to happen to their nation because there's so many brown people coming, etc. Yeah, and that's backed up by 150 years of training the entire world to think about things in a particular way. And, if you're an evolutionary scientist, and I am too, I'm an evolutionist. The problem is that the mainstream of evolutionary thinking has been, this mix of Mendelian ideas and kind of modern statistical ideas, the great synthesis that views human beings as part of the life cycle of genes. But Darwin was right. Evolution also includes the success of entire groups. Multi-level selection, I believe, has won the intellectual battle, but has not yet even been well integrated. If you take an intro course on biology, and then you look for when they talk about multi-level selection, which multi-level selection talks about how the success of higher levels of organization, selection at that level, can occur simultaneously with selection at lower levels of organization. They're always kind of in a dynamic balance and a bit of a fight, and you've got to model that to really understand evolution. Okay, well, multidimensional, multi-level evolutionary science, that is a wonderful, wonderful tool. The cartoon version that says the genes made you do it can lead to a horror. You used the example of diversity. The diversity there was the diversity in the group. And so you have to say, why in, let's say, primate troops are there sometimes what are called wild monkeys? If you're studying them, they're not monkeys necessarily, but a troop of primates. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity there. And these more wild ones are sometimes tolerated, but they become really important under certain circumstances where there's environmental challenges or you have to move an entire troop from one place to another, or there's attacks from without, and you need a kind of well, that's just an example of diversity that's maintained within a group because sometimes for the well-being of the entire troop, that diversity is needed. You can show it just in terms of how people reach decisions when they have a group that has multiple ideas. They come up with better decisions than just allocating it all to a single smart person to make all the decisions when things change. So multi-level selection, I was saying, if you take all the intro texts in biology, yeah, they'll mention it. Look at a few examples, but they won't say that it's central to all of evolution. They will not. And it is. David Sloan Wilson, who is a colleague I've worked with, written books with, etc., sort of dragged multi-level selection back from the ash heap of history in the era of the blind watchmaker and the rest. We're just part of the life cycle of genes, very much in the R.A. Fisher kind of line. And Ed Wilson, who's the more famous of the two, actually, who created sociobiology, that field, dead now, but was an expert in insects, where social insects can't be understood without multi-level selection. The guardian ant will go out there and sacrifice their life for the good of the hive. The bee will do the same thing. A stinger, you're dead if you do the full stinger and it pulls out of your body, but it'll use that to protect the hive under certain conditions. They'll build bridges to allow the queen to get out of the overheated hive. They'll fan their little things. It's amazing stuff. Well, human beings are the most cooperative primates by far, by 100 times more cooperative than chimpanzees, and we share 90+% of our genes. Some people think we might be able to breed with them. Please don't try that. But, that cooperative species that we are has come up with amazing extensions of cooperation, like what you and I are doing right now. Human cognition, I believe, is an extension of cooperation. It's turned back on us now. So what we really need is a science that appreciates multidimensional, multi-level, appreciates and honors the diversity that exists, and really looks for, you were talking about depression. Some of the sensitivity to depression correlates within the person over time as well as between people in a group with positive features. This is not like you're broken and it needs to be suppressed and ridden over. It's a natural response to a certain set of circumstances. Now, you need help in walking out of that. But, there's evidence, like if we take things like what we do with so-called antidepressants, well, that's a marketer's term. That they're not antidepressants. I mean, for goodness sakes, if the black box warnings say, and by the way, this might make you suicidal, that's a little clue. That's probably a marketer's term, not a science term. But, they do appear to actually, when you look now over the longer term, especially if you use them high dose and long term, short term, et cetera, mixed with good psychosocial, okay, I'm fine with that under certain circumstances. But 1 out of 6 human beings in the US of A last year, 1 out of 4 women. Does this make sense? No, it does not make sense. Not when 60% of the women are going to have sexual side effects, and some of these things look like they actually make you more likely to relapse later, which is usually used as proof that you need to stay on the medications. No, it's proof of the long-term effect of those medications.
Right.
And
And despite those numbers, our outcomes continue to worsen. Our rates
Yes.
of suicide, 1 in 4 world overdose deaths happen in the United States, even though we comprise 4.5% of the population. Maternal morbidity is horrible in terms of maternal fetal outcomes. Our obesity rates, we are not living our best and fullest lives. It's funny how the mind works, because when you were talking about that diversity, for some reason, I haven't thought about this book in years. My mind went to Of Mice and Men and the relationship with Lenny and George. Lenny being not as intellectually capable, but very, very physically capable. And George being very intellectually capable, but of smaller stature and not as physically capable. Of course, the relational framer in there is like, what about Lenny and George as an example of diversity? Looking at what the science said in those early years of the eugenics movement, I see some parallels to today. Like, there is some science that is correct and other science that is incorrect. I mean, science is a set of data. It is not a definitive thing. And I wonder if others who had ulterior viewpoints at the time were allowed at that table, if some of the historical travesties that have occurred would have occurred, to bring this more into modern times. How do you appraise, this last maybe decade of the science being pushed more and more as this dogma, as opposed to an open conversation that requires smart people who are doing the research, talking and discussing their theories and ideas and bouncing them off of each other to maybe get to the most likely conclusions?
I'm really kind of shocked by how much people are thinking that science is a particular rule book that's entirely agreed upon, and if you don't follow it, you shouldn't be listened to. Look, we have, I'll say the word discovered. Let me give you a couple of examples. Take psychometrics. If you wanted to understand the meaning of a particular item, you have to look at how it correlates with another one, another one, another one. That's fine. In a collective, in an aggregate. And there's ways of doing that. Take mediational analysis, how we figure out what processes are, or group designs, the comparison between, or personality tests. And when these ideas are applied, we have the idea that, okay, if we're going to understand an individual, what we're going to have to do is quick take a snapshot. And then to understand you, I got to quick take a snapshot of this person, this person, this person, this person, this person. Now you're different from that person. That's what standard deviation is doing. Therefore, I understand where your position is, because here you are on a bell curve. And I say, well, wait a minute. Well, how about the life I'm living over time? Well, we'll do pre-post follow-up. You're going to characterize my whole life with 3 measurements? Seems legit. Yes. Whose life are you characterizing? Well, it turns out statistically, for that to work, statistical physics proved in the 1880s, and they proposed Brunswick, but it was proven in the 1930s to the satisfaction of all physicists who know this theory. It's called the ergodic theorem, that if you're going to go from a collective to predict the behavior of individual units within the collective, they were trying to figure out how gas molecules behaved from a volume of gas. They couldn't measure the molecules, but they could measure the volume, the whole gas. And they worked it out. During the same time when these biostatistical things are coming up, they basically said, okay, this formula says, you can do that. You can go from the behavior of the collective to the behavior over time of the individual if there's no trends. No matter where you put the sensor, every element is following the same dynamic model, which basically would mean, and the first person noticed this is a guy named Peter Molinar in 2004, if what we're doing in our traditional biostats is going to apply to people, particular people, which is what clinicians, what physicians, what psychiatrists, psychology, social work, et cetera, is going to do. If you're going to do that, you have to make sure that, because it's built into the mathematical assumptions, that there are no trends and everyone's the same. Peter's pointing out, look, when you look at the behavior over time of people, that's going to show trends. And when you put the sensor into that gas molecule, volume or gas volume, no matter where you put it, you'll eventually get the same measures. But that's like saying, if I look at you, Ethan, I'm going to get the same thing, same mean standard deviation as you're going to get if you look at me. Well, if you're treating a bunch of frozen clones, that's a good idea. If you're not treating frozen clones, stationarity, no trends, and everyone is the same, is a ridiculous assumption. Now, here's the punchline on it. It's built into all of our biostats. It's an assumption. And when I say this to statisticians, they say, oh my goodness, we've figured out how to do that. We do multi-level modeling. We model each individual first before we nest them into groups. Say, okay, give me your data. Let's look, longitudinal. And then here's what we do. Model each person longitudinally without sharing any information between them, like taking a snapshot of you. But before I go take a snapshot of anybody else, I'm going to wait, let's say, a day and take another snapshot, and then another snapshot, and then another one, and then another one. I'm going to get about 100 snapshots, and I've looked at what's happening. I say, okay, here, Ethan's what's lifting you up, and here's what's pushing you down. Now, I've done that with 1,000 other people or 100 other people. Are you like anyone else? Perfectly sensible way to do that. And that, you'd find that would apply to the use case that we have for this, which is, I want to know how to help this particular person or couple or family or organization. The particular is how I'm going to apply it. We've developed standard scientific methods where, in order to properly assume that the results apply to the particular, you have to assume that everyone's identical and nothing changes. This is built into the formulas. And now, what I'm saying here, now we're standardizing. Here's the way to do science. You can hardly even have a conversation nowadays about the statistical flaws of the DSM. Or I would remember the little big APA. I was about to say little APA, but my wing, I don't belong to APA anymore for reasons going all back to supporting waterboarding and stuff. But that's a long story. But they try to get in there the standard that if you didn't do psychometrics, you can't use your assessment method. Psychometrics was already being built by Galton and his folks specifically for figuring out how to characterize where people are on the bell curve, thinking that predicted their future. It does not. It can't, even probabilistically. And so we're going to build a whole infrastructure and say that's science. Now, that's how many canaries in the coal mine are there like that? Like I have been so shocked, and I have a meeting every week with a statistical group we call One Size Fits None. We gather longitudinal statistical data from around the world, and we look at it in this new way, which we had to invent a word for it. We call it idionomics. Instead of normative statistics, we call them idionomic statistics. They're idiographic, meaning we're looking at individuals over time. And then we seek general laws. The word for general laws is nomothetic. All right. We want general laws in science. But an aggregate doesn't mean that that's the right unit to get general. It turns out generalizing the particular is the better way than generalizing the abstraction of an aggregate. We call them group designs, but if they're intact groups and people actually function as groups, you have to control for that. They're not group designs, they're aggregate designs. And the idea that I can understand you by looking at your position in a snap of time with an aggregate, which is built into Pearson's R, it's built into a t-test, it's built into, and then that's the only thing that's real science. To understand the development of people. And so, our ability to use personalized medicine, personalized psychiatry, precision psychology, whatever term you want to call it, has been so hobbled by this that, we need a real reset button in behavioral science more generally. And so as science settles down into this is science, and, I'm fine with, posting all the things, open science, etc. But right in open science, then these standards start coming in. Did you use a psychometrically proven assessment? Dude, That may be the flaw that makes the whole thing not work. How about if I'll give you an example, Ethan. If you go to ask Indigenous peoples who live in Canada about values, they have a 7-part values system that I've met with the knowledge keepers. I try to understand it. It's very hard for me to understand. It has something to do with nature and with the spirits that are with your ancestors, the spirits that are involved in the earth. It's not Western. It's not a list of virtues. Okay. But we know values are important. So I go use my psychometrically pure, which means all the variability between items, but consistency across people. That's what it's measuring. Yeah, consistency across who? How about Indigenous people? How about if they think about things very differently? So what we're developing in the idionomic labs are ways where you can come up with a knowledge item, let's say, where we'll follow it over time in your own words, and we're using AI to link it to an evolutionary meta model so we can score it and put it in our database. But if you want to, as a person of the Cree tribe living here, want to talk about what is really important to you in terms of an item that speaks of the, honoring your ancestors, and if I tried to push that into some other culture, it would be like, what? What are you talking about? We should have a science that can be that particularized, shouldn't we? And so, we ended up with normative science, which, by the way, is almost always part of the weird world. It's Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which is 12% of the world's population, which produces 95% of the science and 98% of the citations. What? Because we deserve all the attention? No, but because we've rigged the game such that other voices don't get to be heard. And we can change this game if we change it in a way that now fits the needs of actual providers and people. Wouldn't that be cool? And it turns out we can do it.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. The information provided in this podcast and related materials are meant only to educate. This information is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. While I am a medical doctor and many of my guests have extensive medical training and experience, nothing stated in this podcast nor materials related to this podcast, including recommended websites, texts, graphics, images, or any other materials, should be treated as a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All listeners should consult with a medical professional, licensed mental health provider, or other healthcare provider if seeking medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
Thanks again for watching and or listening. If you're passionate about the subjects that I discuss on the channel, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make your voice heard, that these are problems that must be addressed in our society. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I want to hear them. Feel free to reach out on social media or email us at renegadepsych@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest of the show, or you have a connection to somebody that you think would be a good guest, let us know. Thanks again for listening.